Tom Langley finds a bright orange notice zip-tied to his own mailbox. Access to driveway suspended, HOA violation 4.3. The sun hadn't fully stretched over Maple Glen yet, and the morning air carried that end-of-September dampness that stuck to your slippers. Tom, wrapped in a worn flannel robe and carrying his second cup of black coffee, stepped out onto the porch just as the first squirrel darted across his cracked flagstones. The world was still, save for the occasional rustle of brittle leaves scuttling across the pavement. He spotted it immediately, a garish splash of color against his faded green mailbox. The notice fluttered slightly, but it was cinched tight with a plastic tie. Tom approached slowly, blinking behind his wire-rimmed glasses, and read it once without moving his lips. Then again. And then a third time, just to be sure it wasn't some poorly conceived joke. Access to driveway suspended, HOA violation 4.3. Unauthorized paving configuration. Subject to HOA review and penalty. He squinted at the line that followed. This area is designated entry point C for shared community flow. It felt like he'd swallowed something dry. He stood there for a while, one hand still around the warm mug, the other clutching the laminated sheet like a piece of bad fiction. The smell of overripe pears from the Finch tree next door drifted faintly over the hedgerow. "Tom," came Dolores Finch's voice, her sneakers crunching gravel as she crossed the lawn carrying a red-checked cloth bundle. "I brought muffins, Apple, your favorite. Figured you'd need them today." He held up the notice, not saying a word. She stopped 3 steps from him and tilted her head to read. Her mouth tightened as she adjusted her bifocals. Last time they pulled something like this, it started with a flower pot and ended with court papers. Tom exhaled through his nose and gestured with his coffee toward the porch. "Might as well eat before it escalates to arson." Inside, the cottage felt like fall itself, wood polish and cinnamon from the candle Dolores insisted on gifting every year. He set the muffins on the table, careful not to disturb the stack of local newspapers and old property tax receipts. Dolores unwrapped her bundle with care, and Tom reached for the landline sitting crooked on its base. He punched in the HOA's general number. Voicemail. Then the secondary number listed on last month's flyer about Community Harmony Potluck. Voicemail again. He hung up and looked out the window toward the driveway. Something pale caught his eye. He stepped back outside, slippers whispering on the planks. A fresh coat of paint traced a sharp white line down the edge of his driveway, ending in blocky stenciled letters, "Shared entry, no parking." He walked the length of it slowly, his breath visible now in the cool shade. The boundary stopped just where his azalea bush used to be before the HOA trimmed it for visual consistency. Later, he stopped by the community board near the park. Under a laminated calendar of October Spirit Days, and a flyer for yoga with Linda stood a new map, thumbtacked and slightly crooked. A yellow highlighter ring circled his lot. Entry Point C, Open Access Path. Below it, in smaller print, initiative approved by HOA members via proxy, per Clause 7.12. No signature. No stamp. Just the map and that cursed abbreviation. Bold, he muttered. Real bold. On the walk back, he noticed a neighbor quickly duck inside as he passed. Another, raking leaves, gave him a brief, uncertain nod. There were no smiles, no hellos. Just the wind and the scrape of a rake over pavement that had apparently become everyone's but his. By the time he reached the porch again, Dolores had already left a note and gone. "They've lost their minds, bless 'em. But you haven't, so stay sharp. D." He stood there a moment, watching a maple leaf spiral gently to the ground like it knew something he didn't. The sun had risen just high enough to cast a clean diagonal across the yard. He took a slow sip of coffee, still warm. "I should call Michael." Tom walks his street and sees other signs of HOA intrusion, removed planters, replaced mailboxes, fine neighbors. The sun had settled into a crisp, determined rise by the time Tom Langley finished his first cup of coffee and stepped onto his front walk. The air smelled of wood smoke and dry leaves, with a sharp undernote of something metallic, maybe anticipation, maybe just the iron hinges of his old screen door. He tucked his hands into the pockets of his cardigan and started down Maple Glen's quiet loop. It didn't take long to notice the changes. 2 houses down, a ceramic planter shaped like a smiling frog had vanished. In its place sat a bare concrete step, the paint still darker where the pot had been. A few houses beyond that, Mrs. Rourke's mailbox, once a battered blue with hand-painted violets, had been replaced by a generic black box with a bright brass number plate. Tom paused, studying the bolts, still shiny and new. No one had even bothered to scuff it. Across the street, he noticed a green trash bin sitting 3 inches from the curb, marked with a pink sticker, HOA fine issued, been left out past permitted window. He blinked. It was 9:30 a.m. A rake scraped the sidewalk behind him. He turned to see Dolores, her cheeks flushed with the morning air, dragging a canvas bag full of cider bottles. She wore a thick wool sweater the color of pumpkins and moved with purpose. "Morning," she said, jerking her chin toward the stickered bin. "They've got new enforcement volunteers. Teenagers, mostly. Lydia's grandson included. Apparently, he's very passionate about proper container etiquette." Tom gestured with a low grunt. "Funny. I remember when they used to just knock on your door and ask politely." Dolores let out a soft snort and dug into her bag. "Thought you might want to see this." She pulled out a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, and handed it over. 2016, I kept it because it was the first time I realized the HOA had opinions about color theory. Tom unfolded the page. A printed notice, complete with a logo and 4 unnecessary fonts, advised residents that multicolored umbrellas disrupt visual cohesion and that future patio items must be of natural, subdued tones. "I had a turquoise umbrella," Dolores said flatly. "It matched my porch chairs. They said it looked beachy. I told them I liked the beach." Tom folded the letter neatly and slipped it into his jacket. "They've been pushing further than anyone noticed." "I noticed," Dolores said, her voice soft but firm. "We all did. Just didn't think they'd come for a driveway next." They walked in silence for a while, passing a few neighbors who offered strained smiles and polite nods. Tom noticed the way eyes darted toward the sidewalk, the sudden fascination with shrubbery whenever he met someone's gaze. At the corner of Lilac and Birch stood a tan brick house with dark shutters and a porch swing that creaked gently in the breeze. Derek Holmes lived there, retired HOA treasurer, amateur stamp collector, and owner of Maple Glen's only working rotary phone. Dolores tapped the mailbox with the edge of her cider bottle. "He's in." "I saw the blinds twitch." Tom nodded and stepped up to the door. Derek opened it before he could knock. "I was wondering when you'd come by," he said, his voice soft and gravelly like distant radio static. He wore a cardigan with suede elbow patches and held a steaming mug labeled, "I prefer paper receipts." Inside, the air smelled like old books and lemon polish. Derek led them to a sunlit room lined with filing cabinets and framed tax memorabilia. A small turntable spun quietly in the corner, playing something orchestral and slow. "I keep most of the HOA records from before 2019, Derek said, rifling through a cabinet. "Not officially, of course. Just, didn't feel right throwing them out." He pulled a dusty folder marked Entry C, Landscape Development, and spread the contents across a worn oak desk. Line items danced across printed spreadsheets, mulch, signage, temporary fencing. All charged to Community Green Access Zone. Tom frowned. "They've been spending on my driveway." Derek nodded. "It gets better." He flipped open a manila envelope labeled Draft Maps, Not Circulated. Inside were color printouts showing revised lot boundaries. On every version, Tom's driveway was shaded pale green and labeled Shared Entry Corridor, South. Dolores leaned over his shoulder. "That's your name, Lot 47, but not your lines." Tom's voice dropped. "They changed the borders without telling me." "Illegally," Derek added, sipping his coffee. "Even in HOA fantasy land, you can't redraw a plat map and just hope no one notices." Dolores tapped the desk. "You've been hosting HOA potlucks on your land for years." Tom stared at the maps, his jaw set. Later, back on his porch, he watched two children chase each other across the sidewalk. A woman across the street peered out through blinds and quickly vanished. A man passed by walking his dog and offered a vague, "Morning, Tom." Whispers were taking shape, soft, uncertain, but growing. He could feel it. The tension in every hesitant wave. The half-held breath behind each smile. A breeze picked up, rustling the leaves. Dolores handed him a steaming mug of cider and said, "You're going to need more than muffins." Tom, without looking up, answered, "Good thing I have a brother in D.C." Michael Langley, in a navy coat and federal badge tucked away, knocks on Tom's door with a legal pad and 2 cups of diner coffee. The knock came just as Tom was pulling a casserole out of the oven, the smell of ground beef and Worcestershire clinging to the air like memory. He cracked the door open with one hand still gripping a worn oven mitt. Michael stood on the porch, blazer damp at the shoulders, steam rising from the cardboard tray in his hand. "Black, no sugar," Michael said, holding out the cup. Tom stepped aside, waving him in without a word. "Still trying to win me over with diner coffee?" "Still works," Michael replied, brushing his shoes against the mat before entering. The kitchen was a small flannel-colored mess, clippings from the HOA newsletter, yellow legal pads, dog-eared property survey maps. The ceramic pumpkin on the windowsill grinned from behind a curling leaf. Michael scanned the room with a practiced eye and nodded. "You've already started building a case." Tom handed him the mitt. "You'll want this." That pans straight from the 1970s and conducts like a freight train. They sat at the table, casseroles steaming between them, but untouched. Michael opened his leather folio and pulled out a printed copy of the Maple Glen HOA bylaws. Section 4.3, he began, flipping quickly. Mentions driveways only in terms of visual consistency. Nothing about shared access. No language on eminent domain, no usage rights transferred. Tom leaned back, arms crossed. "So what they're doing has no legal leg to stand on," Michael finished. "But that doesn't mean they'll stop." He pulled out another sheet. "This one's worse. They applied for a Department of Community Renewal grant last spring, used an aerial photo of your property. Claimed it was part of a communal greenway improvement initiative." Tom blinked. "You're saying they got federal money using my land?" "Not a large grant," Michael said. "But the implications are significant. It implies ownership. And it's in writing." Dolores shuffled in, apron dusted with flour. "It's rude to plot war without food. You two are no good to anyone on caffeine and adrenaline." She placed a loaf of her meatloaf on the counter and began slicing it with a practiced hand. Michael smiled faintly. "You're still the only one who calls legal prep a war. You've clearly never seen a PTA bake sale in this town," she muttered. Derek joined them 15 minutes later, clutching a battered manila envelope. He slid it across the table like it might explode. "Back when I was treasurer," he said, "I flagged some of these line items for being oddly high. Never got a straight answer. Look at the ones marked groundskeeping." Michael adjusted his glasses and scanned the sheets. $1,800 for weed control on entry point C, he murmured. "There's barely enough grass for a rabbit." Derek nodded grimly. "It's code. I'm guessing most of it went into event prep, tables, banners, catering. All under your trees." Dolores handed Tom a plate and sat beside him. "And now we've got names, documents, and a casserole. We're nearly dangerous." Michael chuckled, then grew quiet. He reached for the final document, a torn notebook page, its margins scribbled with looping handwriting. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Dolores found it in the donation box at last spring's rummage sale," Tom said. "Didn't know what it meant at the time." Michael scanned the note. "Entry C equals leverage point. Push for designation before budget closes." The initials MK sat at the corner. "Marjorie," Michael said. "She's been orchestrating this since before they painted that line." He stood and paced the kitchen once, hands folded behind his back. Then he stopped, pulled out a fresh yellow pad, and began writing. "We start now," he said. "Document everything. Photos, timestamps, invoices. Derek, make copies of everything you've got. Tom, you'll deliver a cease and desist, certified mail. And prepare for them to pretend nothing happened." Dolores handed him a fork. "Eat first." War on an empty stomach, still war. Michael sat, took a bite, and nodded. Still the best meatloaf in North Carolina. A quiet settled over the table, punctuated only by the ticking of the clock above the pantry. Then Michael picked up his pen again and began drafting the header of a formal document. Langley vs. Maple Glen HOA, Notice of Private Easement Violation. Tom opens his curtains to see tents and folding tables set up directly on his driveway. The morning light cast long, copper-colored streaks across the hardwood floor as Tom tugged open the curtains in his front room. What he saw made him pause, then set his coffee down without drinking. On the cracked concrete just feet from his porch, a team of volunteers, wearing matching HOA shirts and cheerful fall scarves, were unfolding tables, erecting small white canopies, and unloading coolers from the back of a panel van. Someone had already staked a "Welcome to the Maple Glen Harvest Fair" banner at the edge of his lawn, tying the strings directly to the iron hooks on his mailbox. He picked up his phone, snapped a photo, then took 3 more from different angles. The date and time stamped clearly in the corner of each. Through the half-open window, he could hear laughter and the clang of metal grill legs snapping into place. He walked into the kitchen where Michael was already seated, sipping his first coffee of the day, suit jacket slung over the back of the chair. "They've started," Tom said simply. Michael stood, peered out the window, then reached for the envelope he'd sealed the night before. Time to make it official. Before breakfast had cooled, he was at the post office, sending certified letters, copies of the formal cease and desist, addressed to Marjorie Keene, Neil Thurston, and the Maple Glen HOA board. Tom watched him from the passenger seat, fingers tapping idly against the dashboard. "You think they'll care?" Michael didn't look over. "They won't back off. They'll double down." He was right. At the community clubhouse, decorated with orange leaves and a plastic scarecrow that grinned too widely, Marjorie Keene stood behind a folding table lined with cider samples and said, with performative cheer, "Our lawyer cousin thinks he's clever. Certified mail means nothing. Posturing." Evan arrived at Tom's porch around noon, a paper flyer in hand, the corners already creased. "I'm supposed to deliver this," he said, not quite meeting Tom's eyes. Tom took it without a word and scanned the contents. Booth layout. Food stations. Kids face painting. Every section located on his property. The map labeled it clearly, Entry C, Main Plaza. Evan hesitated. "I didn't choose where they put the booths. I just copy the schedule." "You've got nothing to apologize for," Tom said, gently but firm. Evan lingered a moment longer before turning back toward the street. His hoodie bore the HOA logo in bright orange, but he walked like someone dragging invisible weight. Later that evening, Tom and Michael attended the HOA open house. The room was bright, warm with too many people packed into a space meant for half the number. Paper pumpkins dangled from the ceiling tiles, and soft jazz played over the speakers. Tom moved carefully along the edge of the room, avoiding attention. Michael made notes on a small legal pad. Dolores stood near the punch bowl, chatting with 2 neighbors in hushed tones. Across the room, Tom paused when he heard Marjorie's voice, low but clear, speaking to a pair of board members near the snack table. "He's unstable but harmless," she said. "Let him take pictures. No one's going to side with a recluse who thinks his driveway is sacred land." Michael caught Tom's eye across the room but said nothing. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling. A moment later, he showed Tom the screen. "Just came in." County clerk responded. HOA's grant submission includes a parcel list. Lot 47 is marked as community-owned. Tom felt the tension shift, like a bolt clicking into place. Michael muttered, "Now we have leverage, and a timeline." A sealed envelope slips under Tom's front door in the early morning, marked only, "Read. Then decide." The rain had started sometime before dawn, the kind that didn't rush but hovered, steady, cold, and soaking through without force. The gutters murmured faintly outside as Tom stood in his robe, blinking at the envelope resting on the hardwood, its corners damp from the moisture that crept in beneath the door. He stooped, picked it up, and turned it over. No address, no sender. Just those words, written in slanted blue ink across the front, "Read. Then decide." He set it gently on the kitchen table, near the cold coffee and a plate of half-eaten toast, and peeled the seal open with a butter knife. Inside, neatly arranged and paper-clipped, were pages of what looked like internal HOA documents. Floor plans. Budget drafts. A title page, Maple Glen Commons, Preliminary Redevelopment Proposal. Tom skimmed, then stopped. Right there, on the first map, was his driveway, his whole lot, in fact, labeled as Public Footpath Zone 2. The boundaries redrawn without a single mention of easement, transfer, or compensation. Michael entered moments later, towel-drying his hair, and saw the expression on his brother's face. "What is it?" Tom handed over the papers wordlessly. Michael's eyes scanned quickly, flipping pages in bursts. He paused at one page with a grid of time stamps. "These were filed before the board even met," he said. "See this? Dated the 10th, but the meeting minutes aren't until the 14th. Tom exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes from watching something break instead of shatter. They brought the file to Derek's den that afternoon. Derek, now used to seeing trouble arrive in manila folders, pulled his glasses to the end of his nose and shook his head as he flipped through. "Never saw these maps," he said. "None of the full board did. This is Marjorie and Neil's pet project. They called it hypothetical planning, but now I'm guessing the ink was never meant to stay dry." Outside, the drizzle had turned to a fine mist. Dolores stood at the window, watching Evan pace across the lawn outside the community center. His HOA hoodie was pulled over his head, but the way he moved, slow, uncertain, doubling back on his own footprints, looked more like someone walking through fog on the inside than out. "He's been there for 20 minutes, Dolores said. "Just pacing. That boy has kind eyes. And tired ones." Michael turned back to the legal packet, pages spread across the table like a topographical map of small-town deception. "He's close to snapping," he said. "We just don't know which way he'll fall. Or who'll catch him," Tom added. That evening, they sat at the dining room table again, candlelight flickering against the cold window panes. Rain drummed a soft percussion on the roof. The kitchen smelled faintly of chili from Dolores' thermos and coffee grounds no one had remembered to throw out. They had the letter to the county clerk drafted, with attachments outlined, exhibits labeled. Michael had underlined every reference to private easement, and Tom had taken a photo of the chalk markings still faintly visible on his driveway. Everything was ready, everything but the unknown. At a little past 8, a knock came at the door. Not hard. Just 2 soft raps, like someone unsure if they should finish the third. Tom opened it to find Evan standing there, damp around the shoulders, hoodie dark with rain. He looked older than he had last week. Or maybe just more exposed. He held nothing in his hands, just stood there, breathing shallow, eyes flicking up to Tom's face. "I didn't write most of those reports," he said quietly. "But they have my name." Tom didn't speak. Just studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Inside, Evan wiped his feet on the mat. His gaze landed on the table, the maps, the documents spread like a jigsaw puzzle no one asked to solve. Tom nodded slowly. "You're ready to testify, aren't you?" At the monthly HOA meeting, the audience is double the usual size. Tom quietly takes a seat in the back row. The community hall smelled of burnt coffee and old floor wax, the kind of scent that lingered no matter how many times they buffed the linoleum. Folding chairs had been arranged in uneven rows, and tonight, nearly every seat was filled. Even the ones along the side wall, usually reserved for stragglers and distracted teens, were occupied. Tom Langley entered quietly, unbuttoned his coat, and slid into a seat in the back row without greeting anyone. A few neighbors glanced his way, some nodding, others quickly looking back to the front. The air held a peculiar stillness, tense, expectant, like a theater just before the curtain rises. Up front, Marjorie Keene adjusted the microphone with the poise of someone used to commanding attention. Neil Thurston sat stiffly beside her, eyes darting toward the stack of handouts in front of him. A young woman in a hoodie with a press badge half tucked into the collar took notes discreetly from the corner. Dolores leaned over to Tom, her voice a low whisper. Nothing louder than truth read aloud. Marjorie cleared her throat, beginning the meeting with the usual pleasantries, minutes approved, upcoming events, seasonal yard decorations. But it all moved with an artificial stiffness, like she was trying to dance in shoes one size too small. Midway through a statement about the harvest fair's overwhelming success, Tom reached down and tapped his phone. A second later, a soft electronic chime came from the speaker near the podium. Marjorie blinked. "We have a guest joining us remotely this evening." Michael's face appeared on the small flat screen, dressed in a gray suit with his glasses catching the light. His tone was measured, calm. "Thank you, Miss Keene. My name is Michael Langley. I'm here in my capacity as both a legal professional and a concerned relative of Mr. Tom Langley, resident of Lot 47. Marjorie opened her mouth, but Michael continued, "I'd like to present findings that raise concerns about the HOA's recent use of his property, particularly related to zoning claims and grant applications filed with the county." He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him filled with documents, scanned grant forms, highlighted sections, survey maps showing Lot 47 misrepresented as community land. "False declarations," he said evenly, filed under official HOA letterhead. "In direct violation of both local easement law and federal community development guidelines." The room murmured. Marjorie raised a hand. "Those forms were..." But she didn't finish, because Evan stood up. His hoodie sleeves were pushed up, and he clutched a sheaf of papers in one hand. He looked down for a moment, then up again. "I signed reports I didn't write," he said, voice quiet but clear. "I was told it was routine. Just standard filing. But the dates didn't match. Some were submitted before the meetings even happened." Silence followed. One neighbor near the front turned to another, whispering something inaudible. The press in turn looked up sharply, pen pausing mid-word. From the third row, a voice broke the hush. "How long has this been going on?" The man stood, white hair, denim jacket, a familiar face from HOA barbecues. "I helped start this HOA," he said. "We were supposed to keep trash bins in line, not redraw property lines." Marjorie stepped forward, smile fraying. "These were decisions made with input from Neil," she added quickly. Neil blinked as though waking. Then, slowly, he stood. "I'm done," he said, and walked straight out the side door, not even taking his binder. At the front row, Derek stood and held up a folder. "These are from 2018 through 2021, he said. "Budget line items listed as consulting fees, but there's no receipts. No invoices. Just transfers." Tom said nothing. He didn't have to. The room had shifted. Something brittle had cracked. From the back, a voice called out, unfamiliar, loud, determined. "Let's vote." Chairs creaked. Eyes turned. Marjorie stiffened. Dolores stood slowly, her hand rising with the calm surety of someone who had waited long enough. "I nominate someone who actually owns the driveway." At dawn on Harvest Fair Day, sheriff deputies appear without sirens and begin taping off Tom Langley's driveway. The sun had barely crested the rooftops when the first cruiser rolled quietly onto Elm Street, its engine low, lights off. Two uniformed deputies stepped out without urgency, their breath visible in the cold October air. They walked with the kind of calm that needed no announcement. A roll of yellow tape unfurled between them, stretching from one corner of Tom Langley's cracked stone planter to the edge of the curb where the HOA had planned their cider booth. Tom watched from his porch, steaming mug in hand. The air smelled of maple leaves and charcoal, not from his house, but from the grill being prepped across the street. A few volunteers had already arrived, hauling coolers and folding chairs. Some wore festive scarves, others tugged hoods tighter against the wind. No one saw the deputies until the tape was up. Marjorie Keene arrived next, stepping out of her SUV in a red wool coat that seemed designed for defiance. She paused as she spotted the tape, frowned, and marched straight toward it. Deputy James met her halfway, clipboard in hand. "This is a mistake," she said, without greeting. James's voice was steady. "This is an injunction. Signed by Judge Harlan. HOA activities on this property are suspended until legal review is complete." Marjorie glanced at the paper he handed her, then crumpled it in one fist. "This land has always been communal." "According to county records, that's not accurate," James replied. "We're here to enforce, not debate." She stood still for a moment, jaw working. Then she turned on her heel and shouted toward the volunteers, "Hold off on setting up. Just a minor issue. Temporary." But already, movement had shifted. Someone folded a table back down. A woman packing cookies into cellophane bags paused, eyes flicking toward the tape. One of the teenagers lowered a speaker stand without plugging it in. The smell of barbecue, once thick and promising, began to fade as grills cooled, untouched. Michael arrived on foot, his coat collar turned up and a briefcase in hand. He offered a quiet nod to James, then stood beside Tom without saying a word. They both watched as the fair slowly unspooled, before it had even begun. Evan emerged from the crowd near the cider booth. His HOA hoodie was gone, replaced by a dark windbreaker. He stepped forward, cleared his throat once, and addressed no one in particular but loud enough for all to hear. "This isn't about a driveway," he said. "It's about trust. About how rules are used. About who gets to decide what belongs to whom." Heads turned. The press intern snapped a photo. Tom remained quiet until the intern approached, notepad raised, tentative. "Mr. Langley, any comment?" He didn't pause long. "This was never personal," he said. "It was about respect." And then, like a closing gesture to a ceremony no one had rehearsed, the investor pair who had stood near Marjorie at past events, sunglasses, boots too clean for real yard work, stepped back from the crowd. They exchanged a few quiet words and turned toward the road, their car waiting with the engine running. Volunteers began gathering their things. Tents collapsed inward like tired lungs. Chairs folded. Signs came down. By 10 o'clock, the only evidence of the fair was a ring of crushed leaves and 2 boxes of unused flyers. Tom remained on the porch, eyes on the yard as neighbors passed. Some nodded. Some said nothing. But their pace slowed, and their steps felt lighter. Dolores arrived just before noon, wrapped in a scarf knitted in the colors of autumn, rust, maroon, faded gold. She didn't speak at first. Just walked to the edge of Tom's flower bed, knelt carefully, and placed a small American flag in the soil beside the mums. She stood, brushed her hands together, and said with quiet finality, "First time this place felt free in years." 2 weeks later, a new wooden sign is hammered into the grass, "Langley Drive, private. Shared by respect." It was a clear morning in early November, the kind that felt quiet even with the birdsong. Most of the trees in Maple Glen had surrendered their leaves, which now curled in coppery spirals along the edges of porches and hedgerows. A few jack-o'-lanterns lingered, their carved smiles beginning to pucker with time, but the wreaths on the doors had turned to dried corn husks and cranberry-colored bows. Tom Langley stood at the edge of his yard, holding a hammer in one hand and watching as Evan secured the final nail into the new sign. The wood was fresh, sanded smooth, and carved by hand. The words were simple: Langley Drive, private. Shared by respect. Not official, but somehow more meaningful. Evan stepped back, brushing sawdust from his palms. "It looks right," he said. Tom nodded. Not bad craftsmanship, for someone who used to sign things without reading them. Evan gave a half-smile. "Working on that." The HOA board had formally disbanded the week before. What remained now was a small volunteer committee, neighbors who didn't want power so much as clarity. They'd called it an advisory circle, mostly so no one had to print new stationery. Marjorie had moved out quietly, the for sale sign appearing overnight and vanishing almost as fast. Neil hadn't been seen at the diner since the vote. Michael was packing up the last of his files inside the house. He'd pushed his return flight once already but insisted this morning was the real goodbye. Out front, Dolores was setting up a long folding table across the end of Tom's driveway. She wore a cardigan the color of cinnamon and had brought 2 pies, 1 apple, 1 something labeled Harvest Surprise, with a note that said contains nuts, but not grudges. Neighbors filtered in slowly. A couple from the cul-de-sac brought cider in a thermos. Someone's teenager carried over a Bluetooth speaker and played jazz standards softly. A little girl handed Tom a folded sheet of construction paper with crayon drawings and blocky letters that read, "Thank you for the safe sidewalk." He placed it gently beside the rocking chair that waited near the porch, freshly repaired, joints oiled to a whisper. The same chair his wife had favored before the world quieted. Michael stepped out and stood beside him. "Didn't expect pie to be part of your legal victory lap," he said. "You'd be surprised what counts as due process around here," Tom replied. They walked the length of the driveway one last time together, shoes crunching over loose gravel. The tape was gone, the signs packed away, the tension that once buzzed at every fence line now replaced with the hum of casual chatter. Near the steps, Dolores was pouring coffee into mismatched mugs and telling Evan a story about the old school carnival when someone brought a goat and the principal ended up in a tree. Tom settled into the rocking chair, testing its balance. He leaned back slightly, the gentle creak greeting him like an old friend. The morning air was brisk but not biting. Steam rose from the mug in his hand. He looked out over the yard, now his again in name and spirit, and then to the people gathered under the low autumn sun. Some talked. Some listened. No one was in a hurry. He sipped his coffee. Not bad, for an unstable man. The leaves had mostly fallen by the time peace settled over Maple Glen, but what remained was stronger than any season: quiet understanding, shared effort, and a porch light left on a little longer. In the end, it wasn't just legal letters or boundary lines that changed the neighborhood, it was patience, courage, and the decision to stand when silence would have been easier. When power is misused, it divides. When challenged with clarity and care, it teaches even deeper roots how to bend toward justice. Maybe it starts with a driveway, but it ends with neighbors finding their way back to one another. Like a rocking chair fixed with steady hands, some things are worth keeping upright.